Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Laure, most of you know me. I will talk today about score sampling and in particular speak about a piece that some of you already know. It's a piece for ensemble. It's like an hour-long ensemble piece that I composed last year, and it employed score sampling as a process, as a score writing process. This is the lecture that I'm giving now is part of my habilitation here. So I have a lot of material, and it might just take longer than an hour. But feel free to leave earlier if you want to. Like, I'm not taking that personally. You can leave whenever you feel like you have to go. I will also be reading off a manuscript, but feel free to interrupt me. You know, it doesn't have to be so formal. You can interrupt me if you need clarification for something, or if you have any questions or things like that. Also, I'm going to show a lot on the projection, and it's going to be some score details and PD patches and stuff like that. So if you sit in the back, you might not see the details, so feel free to move to the front for that. So, I'd like to begin today with a brief discussion about the nature of software instruments, and in particular the software sampler, and how that relates and differentiates itself to traditional acoustic instruments. Before digital technology, the physical limits of the sound generating part of the instrument and the physical limits of the means to control the sound generator, i.e. the interface of the instrument, so to speak, co-constituted the development of each musical instrument in directly related ways. Longer strings on the wooden frame meant longer fingerboard and larger resonant body, which in turn meant wider stops for the finger placement and so forth. Physical, quote, natural limits had to be negotiated alongside the desire and development of new musical material. This directly related physical development between interface and sound generator alongside and according to historical musical material developments was radically upended by the invention of digital instruments. Think of any software, any virtual instrument, in the sense of any software or virtual instrument that speaks the language of an operating system, can be connected to a keyboard, for instance, or any other interface. This is what is truly radically about new software instruments. The interface has been separated off from the sound producing, the sound generating part, or content generating, if we speak of multimedia setups in general, of this configuration called musical instrument. Leaning on a somewhat problematic mind-body metaphor, we can say that the sound generating part of the musical instrument has been fully disembodied, gone virtual as opposed to physical. This quality of a musical instrument can be described as distinctly postmodern, following Frederick Jameson in his characterization of the difference between the modern and postmodern condition. Acoustic instruments in this sense have a, however mediated, privileged relationship to nature, in that they are an expression of the physical condition of the resonant qualities of material objects, and the continued development and evolvement thereof according to the changing desires and needs of the related aesthetic paradigms and practices. These instruments, they speak of nature as an other, of which they are made of, and of which they are made separate from. Acoustic instruments and their musical capabilities are wrested, so to speak, from the physical limitations of these material objects, from the physical limitations of nature as other. In the postmodern condition, nature disappeared completely, economically speaking, as a consequence of the latest stage of capitalism that subordinates all aspects of life on this planet to the logic of the market and commodification. Aesthetically speaking, as a consequence of these processes of commodification that subordinate nature with a capital N and every notion of something natural or authentic to a symbolic representation thereof. Software instruments, in this view, have only this referential, symbolic relationship to nature, a glossy, shiny surface of an immaterial object that can be replaced with the switching of a button. The instant fungibility of the thoroughly commodified object in absence of its unmediated relationship to its authentic, natural essence. The software instrument in this sense is the perfect simulacrum, the copy that stands in for the original, having lost its reference. Two digital instruments are of particular interest in this context, the sequencer and the sampler. The interesting thing that even early instantiations of both the sequencer and the sampler introduced into the configuration of a musical instrument was that both, in their own way, but also and more powerfully in combination, enabled not just the production and manipulation of sound, but the structuring and shaping of how sounds unfolded in and over time. They were not only sound-producing instruments, but a sequencer and a sampler are also structure-producing instruments, devices that enabled the manipulation of sound and of sounds in time. Let's look at the concept of a sampler a little more closely. A sampler is a device that uses small, or sometimes not so small, pieces of existing pre-recorded music or live-recorded sounds and maps them onto a playable, physical or virtual surface or interface, thus making these snippets of recorded sounds, called samples, available for the creation of new musical structures. A sampler is therefore a device that makes, to speak with Johannes Kreidler, music with music. It is a meta-instrument proper, and in that sense, probably the most paradigmatic postmodern instrument. The hermeneutic of intertextuality could not find a more succinct representation in music than in the sampler. Samplers are most commonly used in conjunction with a sequencer, but also standalone, without the time structuring capabilities of a sequencer. A sampler has characteristics that go beyond that of the straightforward sound-generating capabilities of a traditional acoustic or electroacoustic music instrument. By virtue of its implication of the temporality of the sampled material, samplers introduce a second temporal structure over and on top of the fictional time of the primary temporal grid, expressed as the sequence of musical events performed by the sampler. It is as though within each sample there exists its own temporality, like in a Matryoshka figurine, which does not provide one specific sonic quality as a musical gesture directly linked to the choreographic movement as it would in a traditional instrument, but rather a gesture that is composed of another musical gesture, one that comes with its own behavioral dramaturgy. In this sense, a sampler does not just produce sounds and musical gestures, it also produces structures with and as these sounds and musical gestures. The focus of this discussion, however, is not a history or theory of sampling in its usual form. I'd like to focus on my own practice as a composer and how the concept and structure of sampling, coming from electronic music, translates back into the process of writing instrumental scores. In my recent works, I have sampled other pre-existing music and created purely acoustic textures which embody highly digital processes in the analog practice of instrumental music playing. They constitute an attempt to translate hard digital machine processes into the chamber musical ensemblic play of acoustic instruments or voices. It may be comparable to the way in which photography enabled a movement like photorealism, or how the internet enabled all kinds of post-internet visual art objects moving from the online world back offline, prints and sculptures, in the way how a new technology allows for the recasting of an existing one. In comparison to the mere technological advancements in commercial industry, where one technology outdates and simply replaces another, artistic practices as aesthetic languages attest to a socio-political and socio-cultural texture of implications, where new technologies add new nodes to a web that eventually enriches and diversifies possible modes of artistic expression. Chronological supersedence of technologies phrase into lateral coexistence of languages, or codes, to use a more postmodern terminology, which itself may be an indication of the postmodern condition of our Western, now increasingly homogenized global village-like societies under late multinational capitalism. The advent of photography did not usher in the end of painting, the end of electronic, the advent of electronic music, be it as realistic to acoustic instruments as it may be, did not, so far at least, usher in the end of instrumental music. What can be observed instead is a coexistence with a fruitful exchange of ideas and materialities. This is a framing in which I would like to place my own artistic practice. My recent instrumental acoustic works would be practically impossible to compose without the help of a computer and the algorithms I programmed, the conceptual basis of which goes back to my long-standing experience in electronic music, and specifically to sampling. Digital technology here is not just an aid for a process which would be more laborious to write by hand, so to speak, but these compositions are fundamentally impossible to write without this technology and its structure of thinking, which not only includes software instruments and architectures, but also the wider context of the infinite Internet archive as a source for musical material. This talk comprises two major sections. In the first section, I will give a very technical breakdown, a step-by-step description of the composition process of my ensemble piece with the long title Seht meine Wunden und an meinen Beinen die Narben meiner Wunden, denn wir sind lange gewandert, from 2022. And in the second section, I will contextualize these technologies in a wider cultural framework and reflect on these processes under certain terminologies key to postmodernism, like depthlessness, so Tiefenlosigkeit, if you're familiar with it, depthlessness, intertextuality, new syntax and syntagmatic relations, new technology, loss of historicity, and I will conclude with the political implications thereof. Seht meine Wunden und an meinen Beinen die Narben meiner Wunden, denn wir sind lange gewandert, was a commission by the Sonic Matter Festival in Zurich, funded by the Ernst von Siemens Musikstiftung, and written for the Ensemble Collegium Novum Zurich. The title, which is a quote from Edouard Glissant, whose writing has been a constant accompaniment for me during this time, is as personal and poetic as a title as I have chosen for a long time. This is a side note. This is related to an episode of loss and personal grief for which Glissant's writing provided a healing, nourishing resource. Apart from this anecdotal background, it is also Glissant's relationship to landscape as a scene of which his philosophy is an expression of. The landscape, with its nonlinear syntax, is the context through which time can be experienced as folded into its spatial logic. This is at least what I hope this piece to achieve. It was composed between July and November 2022, while most of the writing happened within 6 weeks, in September and October of 2022. It employs the long form. At the beginning of the negotiations, it was decided that it may be up to 60 minutes long for a full chamber ensemble, and it is my attempt to move beyond the idea of a time-based concert dramaturgy altogether, and to provide, or to give the impression of at least, a more space-based topographical dramaturgy, by way of a specific kind of non-implication of the listener's perspective, or perspectival demands, or my fantasies thereof, at least. Laure Berland's notion of the animated still life and its related forms like the tableau vivant, the living sculpture, or even Gertrude Stein's landscape theater, if you will, provided the initiating starting point or image to think towards non-rhetorical, texture-based syntagmatic relations in music, as well as towards the non-narrative import of musical gesture. One of the conceptual goals and compositional tasks for this piece with the long title was to push the idea of using very limited sampling material over a very long period of time to an extreme. How little of material can sustain 1 hour of music? This applies not just to the quantitative amount of musical material, but crucially also to the qualitative characteristic of the material. How little and how simple of a material can sustain 1 hour of music? By pushing this extreme, I wanted to test how far I can go with this compositional technique that I called score sampling. Underlying this consideration is the realization that the simpler and the more reduced the starting material, the more strongly articulated will be the structural transformations applied to this material. This is why the search for sampling material was guided by the idea to find musical material as simple, schematic, and stereotypically empty as possible, whatever that means. The excerpt of Ralph Vaughan Williams' Third Symphony, which I came across via a Spotify playlist aptly titled Relaxing Orchestra Music, became more of a cultural signifier for what classical music stands in for many people in the fully commodified cultural landscape of late capitalism. Relaxing string music with a therapeutic function rather than an aesthetic evasion of functionalism. This is what made such an excerpt interesting to me. By way of its context, it has become a fully commodified sound object with the flatness and emptiness of a musical signifier devoid and uprooted from its original significatory frame of reference, for which the Spotify playlist, a complete and random mix of genres, styles, and historical musical practices thrown together under the paradigm of its specific affective functionalism, is the perfect instantiation of a new postmodern non-context, so to speak. The sample itself comprises 3, or better maybe 2.5 elements, the last one of which is the beginning of a new flute melody, which is cut off by the sampling window and only present in its initiatory gesture. The 2 main elements are first the Dorian-type mixtures of the strings, moving in a simple up and down movement, and woven into it is a horn melody, doubled by the clarinet, alternating 2 repeating long notes, supported 1 octave below by the clarinet. It is a 4-bar structure that can be divided into 2 + 2 bars, and these 4 bars constitute the entire musical material for 60 minutes of music. This is how it sounds like. This was the entire, all of the material that I've used for this 60 minutes of music. What is apparent is the toned down nature of articulation, creating an even texture without any overly dynamic eruptions. This makes the sample an ideal choice for creating a kind of meta texture that this composition tries to be, in that slices from all parts of the sample can be put next to one another while maintaining a contiguous and continuous texture. and without having one slice of a particularly expressive gesture dominate the entire piece. If this score sampling process consists of an endless recombination of similar but never exactly the same slices of a sample, this excerpt provides a set of evenly formed building blocks that can be easily and freely integrated with one another while maintaining an uninterrupted gesture. That way, the gestural affect of a certain phraseology is maintained while its specific instantiations vary endlessly. And lastly, since I decided to create an even but ever-changing texture with as little sampling material as possible, it was necessary to find material where each part can be harmonically combined with any other in a way that does not disrupt a harmonic continuity. This Vaughan Williams excerpt provided exactly that, with the simplicity of its Dorian-type modal harmonic structure. Harmonically, this gesture has no real center or direction which it is gravitating towards. Rather, it exhibits some kind of circularity, which this piece is heavily relying upon, exacerbating the sense of circularity and directionlessness by way of slicing together small snippets from every corner of the entire sample. Also, I've had a lot of discussions with people. People ask me, like, why did you write such a tonal piece and use such tonal harmonies, which I haven't done before. Besides the fact, which is not very satisfying to say that it worked best with this type of material, it's also, and I've also tried more avant-garde music to put into the sampler. It's really something that I didn't set out to write a tonal piece of music. I set out to write a piece that uses sampling as a technique, and I was just trying to find which material works best. So that's kind of all I want to say at this point about this discussion. So once the sample was found, there were two more things to do. First, I had to find the score excerpt and transcribe the exact excerpt into notation software, and then divide all durations as multiples of tied 16th notes. So you see there's the original, and this is basically already the target instrumentation, more or less. And it's the same fragment, just notated in tied 16th notes. And each 16th note gets an index number seen at the very top, from 1 to 48. The reason for this, and I talk about it later in more detail, is that a sampled excerpt needs to be legible along a numerical grid of discrete steps, so that the sampler can decide from which starting point of the sample and for how long it has to read the exact snippet of the score. In the end, it's also not the sampler that actually reads it. I'm getting a set of Excel lists from the patch, which I then manually transcribe into a score.
Sorry, I have a question. I guess here you do have to decide which is going to be your unit.
Yeah.
So why 16th notes? Why not 8th or even 32nd notes?
And it depends on. For this piece, I tried different quantization steps, and they each yield different results. And in certain parts of the piece, I used 8 notes as a grid. In some, I used 16th notes as a grid. It's really just I'm using all kinds of quantizations. So just for this presentation, I'm just showing you one of them, but I'm also transcribing it into 8 notes, sometimes into 32nd notes. Then the excerpt from the audio recording needs to be time compressed or time stretched to better fit the quantization grid of the score. In electronic music jargon, this is often referred to as warping or quantizing the musical material, which a software like Ableton Live, designed for beat-oriented commercial music, does automatically as soon as something is recorded into it. I'm doing this in Reaper. That's the audio file. And you can use stretch markers to align it to the beat grid, which you can see up there. And when it's, I'm going only so far, but yeah, so this is how I try to more or less make it align the temporal grid of the score, the idealized temporal grid of the score. There's a limit though as to how perfectly I quantize the audio recording and make it match its idealized rhythmic grid, because the rhythmic imperfections of this quantization process result in musically interesting artifacts, especially when the sampler cuts through the continuity of a musical phrase and does not perfectly align its snippets with the beginnings and or endings of a phrase. It is these digital artifacts that I try to capitalize on later in the process when I transcribe the numerical lists from the sampler according to how I hear them in the audio output of the sampler, resulting in irregularities such as these chains of triplets. You see here? That's from the score later, but you see there's sometimes like chains of triplets which are basically just digital artifacts where the sampler cuts too early or too late into musical phrase. Same with these ornaments in the clarinet and the horn, for example. It's basically it's the bleeding over of a musical phrase when it's subjected to a hard digital cut. And I translate that into a score as a little ornament, for example. Then I move to the sampler, and I'll just show you what I do. This is so this is the sampling patch that I programmed in PD, and it has several sections. Here I can basically open the sample. I choose the sample that I'm using, Ray Vaughan Williams. I type in the original tempo and the desired tempo. So I can slow it down, speed it up, and transpose. This is the meter section that basically determines the rhythmic structure, and I will go into that more detail later. This is a bit too complex to go into right now, but important are meter and location, those two sections. I'll describe them in more detail. First, let's listen to the sample in the sampler. So that's that. I can slow it down a bit. Sort of one of the core operations that I've programmed into this sampler is what I called a increment sequencer, and this is this little device here. What it does is basically think of you type in a starting value, an increment by how much it increments per index, and an ending value when it starts looping around. So when I type in 0, 1, 4, it means start at 0, increment by 1, and go back to 0 when you reach 4. And the result you can look at, if you look at this one here, is simple. It comes from 0 to 3 in loops. Yeah? It's quite simple. Not very interesting itself. What it then does, I have a list of, for example, this is our time signatures, 3/16 notes, 3/8, 1/4, quarter note, 2/4. So this is a so this is a simple metric structure, right? And then the sequencer tells this list to pick according to the index that is entered into the store object. So if I just go from 1 to 3, from 0 to 3, it will go from this. It will go to the indexes sequentially. So if you go through it and you look at the bottom, you see 3/8 starts at 1, start at 0. There we go. So 3/16, 3/8, 1/4, 2/4. So this is a simple metric structure. Not very interesting. And it will just keep repeating if I keep pressing the button. So what the increment sequencer does though, when it becomes interesting, is when instead of an increment of 1, I type in a irregular number, like 1.31. What it then does, see, it counts 131, 262, 393, and then it jumps over 0, because if you always add 131 as an increment, it skips 0. Then it skips 0 again, skips 0 again, now it skipped 1, and so forth. So by entering a sort of an odd increment value, it's a very simple process to create sort of endlessly varying structures out of very simple material. And then the store object just basically retrieves these varying indexes with various skipped indices as a list of a rhythmic structure. So if you type in this here, so this is just with an increment of 1, simple times rhythmic structure, always repeating in loop. And if we type in an irregular increment, it sounds like this. Yeah, so a very simple process to generate endless variation, basically, from very simple material. Okay, and then let's listen to the music again. So we have created this rhythmic structure, and then we are still the same process of increments can be applied to the part of the sampler that determines the location of the sampler. So I also can type in a series of location changes and an increment value, which then the sampler jumps through the sample at various points according to these structures. So if you listen to it like that, as we did before, it's already sampling it a little bit. We can also go backwards. If we go, let's say, -3, then it will go through the sample backwards. We can also enter here a sort of an odd or floating point number, so that it's not always -3, but it also starts adding irregular numbers, and then by what's the word? Cutting it to an integer, it always starts skipping certain locations. So if you type in this, And maybe I can already show you the score. Yeah, there's a lot of time signature changes in this piece. So. So there you can see how that's basically the beginning of the piece. I'll play a longer excerpt in a moment. Let's go back to the presentation. This is basically on the top you can see what the sampler basically provides for me. Bar number at the very top row, sample location, which is determined by the excerpt, and then the time signature for how long is the snippet. So you see the first sample starts here, 3 16th notes long. So I copy this chunk. Then the second bar starts at sample number 22 here, and is 3/8 notes long. 1, 2, 3. So it's this section. Then I copy and paste this section. And then third bar starts at sample 19 here, and it's 1/8 note long. It's a small section here. And this is it. This is how I basically then copy and paste the whole piece together.
How do you transcribe in terms of, I assume it's very like exhausting, like to, I mean, how the patch works, and then do you get like some sort of list, and then you...
Yeah, this is the list.
And then you transcribe by hand.
Well, yeah. It's a very meditative process.
I'm asking because I kind of do the same thing with patches, and I always find it very exhausting to get some sort of list and then go to the score and then get chunks of like. But it's like this.
But it's also there's methods to make it faster and things like that. But it's also something I kind of like this process too.
Yeah.
So far I haven't found a way to automate it yet. Yet. Yeah. Then I'll just play maybe the first 10 minutes or so of the piece, and you can follow the score. Such a bad rendering. Let me use this. Maybe this is better. Not really. Yeah, I'm sorry. We have to get a higher resolution.
Smartboard.
Yes.
Definitely.
Definitely.
Playing, right? It's not the sample cut, but it's like real.
Yes, this is the ensemble I'm playing.
Yes.
Let me just see if maybe VSC is better. Oh, it doesn't look like it. So we have to deal with that. That's the first section of the piece.
How do you decide where to put the letters for rehearsal?
So the piece has, as I showed you, when I showed you the patch, so sort of each configuration of meter structure and location changes determines one section, and the piece has like 30 sections. And then I start typing a different pattern. For example, just before I cut, there was a literal repeat for 7 bars, which is something I haven't done before. So then the meter is actually always the same. So there are like these different sections where I use different parameters to generate of the same material slightly different ways of moving through the material. And so, and I can't go into this, but I also have like a whole like formal plan of the piece of like how the 60 minutes are divided into different sections, and then I compose them one by one according to these patterns. And so each section is a rehearsal layer, basically.
Oh, okay.
I have a very practical question. It seems like you very consciously left the meters that can come out of this patch in the score. Did you also consider writing everything into 4/4 to make it more easy for the musician?
Yeah, no, I did never considered that. What I do though, if you look at the score, for example, remember the patch brings out like 3/16, 3/8, 1/8, and then again 3/16, and then I do combine, for example, 3/8 and 1/8 into 4/8. So I do go over it and make it sort of the whole phrasing of like, okay, this is one phrase, and the whole composite phrasing that comes out of it is something I do in the process afterwards. But keeping the metric structure is very important for me, because it really adds a different flow to the piece. It's where like you can never settle into a specific meter, but you're constantly changing the meter, and that's I think one of the key principles and of the qualities of the piece. I think that it has over 2,000 time signature changes.
I totally agree. I just was wondering if the ensemble was then saying like, oh, couldn't you make it more easy for us? Okay. No.
That was not the question.
On what factors did you consider the increments? So are the increment numbers arbitrary, or did you just think?
It depends on if I want certain repeating patterns. I use like even or like a sort of integers or some kind of more even fractions. If I want ever-changing patterns, I use prime numbers, basically.
Okay.
Yeah, because then you end up with you have a very limited source material, but the resulting texture is never exactly the same. There's always some kind of skip at some point that is not there before.
So you chose the numbers for the function they are serving.
Yeah, it's basically this is the process of composing. I then have I go section by section, and I go through certain patterns, and I change it a bit. I want more repetitive. I want more rapid change. I narrow the window of sampling that the location goes through. And so these are all things of composing in the end, where I'm then deciding on what the structure should be like. Yes.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. First, I see it, but because we didn't hear the whole piece, if there's a kind of filtering after you get the material. So like when you are writing, if there's some kind of decisions you make after.
Yeah, so when I get this, let's go back to the thing, it's easier to show it here. So when I'm in this stage, when I'm assembling the piece from the list and the source material, and when I start copying things together, and then I sort of do like the first 20 bars or something. Then I start copying them together, and then I listen to the mock-up that I have through the sampler, and then I hear there's a little ornament that is not there in the notation, or there's like actually the rhythm is more triplets than 16th notes, and then I adjust the source, and then it's a process of kind of negotiating. I'm less interested in this and more interested in the artifacts of the sampler, and then trying to transcribe those basically. And then also the whole aspect of instrumentation. I didn't go into it now. At the beginning, I used very much the source instrumentation as the target instrumentation. Later in the piece, I really changed the instrumentation, moved certain melodies around. First of all, for logistic reasons, because the horn player cannot play like an hour-long melody. But also to kind of differentiate the different sections that the piece has. And there's also in the piece, in the middle section of the piece, there's 2 trios where it's only percussion, piano, and harp, and then for like 10 minutes, and then it goes back to the ensemble. So this is another process that I'm going through.
That was actually more or less my second question. It was because in the beginning I had the feeling it was more or less a whole sample that was as a whole thing and was played, but I was wondering if at some points they are overlapping, so different layers of it, or like, but yeah.
We can jump to the very end, for example. I mean, there's sections where it's this, for example, the trio section. It's very different instantiation of the same material, basically. Or later, actually, also transpose everything up a little bit. Quite exhausted. Yes.
So could I just ask you about the repeat? Was that something that happened because of the conditions you put in, or was that like a decision to repeat, to loop that?
Yeah, that was a decision, a formal decision, because when I use these structures, so for example with prime numbers, I get textures that are ever changing. You can never get a repeat. It's kind of like an engine that always keeps moving forward. And I, as a formal decision, I decided I want these sections where we constantly keep moving in a certain way, and then I want to arrive at a point where it's still, we kind of rest for a moment, we kind of go in a loop, and then it keeps going again. So this was a very formal decision that these sections I want to have literal repeats, and then move on to, so that we get this very slight difference between literal repeats and kind of repeat, but not exactly the same thing. So this difference was something I was interested in.
Can I also ask about dynamics? Like, because in the 10 minutes you showed us, there were like a few crescendos, accents, but then like the trio you just showed us was like really specific with dynamics.
Yeah.
Like, can you, what was the decision based on, like, because I'm guessing that the dynamics in the trio were like what you were hearing and transcribing the dynamics of the recording.
More or less, yeah.
Can you make, what was the decision to have like a big section without and then one with like super? So generally there's several stages in this whole process. There's the first is kind of copying, pasting, where it's kind of the raw material, and then I go over it and look for larger phrases and structures, and then I kind of bring them out a bit, and then there's also in the string and wind section as a larger, like later in the piece I actually also do much more with the dynamics. Although I actually also like the fact that there's very little written as dynamics, that somehow the rhythmic structure and the way things fall onto the beat or off the beat, and that's already kind of suggests a lot of dynamic phrasing in some way, and I kind of just want to let the musicians interact with that mostly. And then with the trio section, I actually, for the trio, I created like a mock-up of the trio as a sample, as an audio sample, and also sampled that. And then working with because the sample I always went backwards, sort of the sample always went through the sample backwards, but these are all attack instruments with decay. so that in the end you would always have like, when you cut into a decay, you get like very different degrees of dynamic nuances, and those almost like MIDI notes, like a bit loud, a bit quiet. So this is something that I then also try to transcribe in the end. Yeah.
I had a question because of the material. You said in the beginning you tried with different, and I think this soothing quality of this sample, you just imagine if it was like harsh metal noise all the time. I think it also plays with this, that we can really sink in the sound and really be inside the sound, and with this kind of broken odd beauty that is always not real but also there, that we you kind of crack open the time. So otherwise I think it wouldn't be possible to really give in, or also that we don't expect anything anymore at some point.
Also when you try to imagine the source material had a very, I don't know, like one very dominant gesture, for example. Like that dominant gesture would dominate the entire hour in a very like annoying way, probably. So I was looking for a very even texture that then you can really combine things and then bring out the subtleties of these combinations that are kind of, The hope is also that the piece, you know, it's not really a piece about Ralph Vaughan Williams. It's about, it's more the material that then articulates a different kind of structure.
Yes, of course. And time, because you have this, you mentioned that you made like a decision about the formal. What does it mean for you? Because then, of course, it's very grave if something finally changes. So how did you decide when? Like after a half an hour or?
Yeah. So actually, I don't know if I can show it now. I could, but I don't want to. But it's I basically use a formal, like also a PD badge, with which I basically create a formal structure that is more or less, it's quite related actually to Lachenmann's Strukturnetz in some way. But what he used it as, how he used more serial techniques written down on notation paper. I'm actually using more weighted probabilities in PD, but in the end it's the patch gives me a set of empty containers, and I actually like the fact that I don't have much of a I don't come with it or I don't approach it with a clear imagination. It's actually something that's quite foreign to me. It's something that's quite it's very abstract, and then my work is to kind of make that concrete and kind of make that which is something other from me. Not, it's not, because it forces me to, okay, now I have like a 7-minute opening which I didn't plan to, but now I need to figure out material that works for 7 minutes. So it kind of forces me to think beyond the limits of my own imagination in some way. So I'm using a very sort of abstract temporal structure that I, before even thinking very much about the musical content, to then confront my imagination with it and then think about material that works with this, so that I'm forcing myself to kind of do that. Yeah. So that's kind of my strategy with regards to form. So I would have another like 15 minutes of more theory around this. If you're
a quick question. You kind of answered already about all the instrumentation that they want to do.
Yeah.
I think also you had a question before me.
Yeah, we can also have more questions. Hugo, did you have a question?
Yes, I had a question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm quite curious how you ended the piece, because I can imagine that is also a challenge when composing it.
Yeah, the end is basically it just cuts off. That's the end. Yeah, couldn't think of any other way to end this piece. You know, it just like keeps going. I mean, you can listen to it if you want.
Also, how did you transition from the instrument? I'm also curious about that.
It's just cuts.
Oh, okay.
Just
cuts. Just cutting it. Yeah.
And also the idea of something is whole that is hidden behind, right? Like the source had this was whole, and you cut it.
You mean that the score is the sample is an excerpt to like a whole? That is
Yeah,
cut?
I mean, the source had
Yeah.
this. I mean, it's also cut, but it's also a snippet.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I kind of would like to. Maybe I'll speak like 10 more minutes that actually also refers to this aspect, and I would like to contextualize it a little bit to postmodern theory that talks about this cutting it through. So Frederick Jameson's seminal postmodernism, the cultural logic of late capitalism, provides the theoretical framework and the methodological devices along which the spectrum of postmodern aesthetic, as well as its contradistinction to a modernist counterpart, is drawn. Maybe instead of reading this, I'll just briefly show this. Frederick Jameson talks about the difference between modernist and postmodernist aesthetics, and then he explains it at the by comparing Van Gogh's pair of boots and Warhol's diamond dust shoes. What really struck me in relation to my work with regards to these two paintings is also that this painting has a way of implicating the viewer in a way that the viewer, the pieces or the painting is organized around the centrality of the viewer. So the way the viewer is looking at it is organizing the painting in the sense that the boots are in the center, there's like a nice frame around it, and so forth. Whereas like diamond dust shoes, in a way negates that. There's a reference to a larger totality that is just simply cut out in some way. And in that sense, whereas this implies like, it's almost like an utopian gesture. That's what Frederick Jameson talks about, that this basically implies you can have an hermeneutic gesture towards what these boots refer to. That means peasant life, hard work, the peasant toil, and all this stuff. And this is something that is implicated in this piece as something that we can refer to. This work has much less of a reference to, it's much more on the surface in some way. It's really like a piece that doesn't talk so much about the depth of these objects, but rather the assemblage and the kind of the way they're just presented to us on the surface level. And in some way, for me, when we think of musical gesture as something in the modernist paradigm, when you think about, for example, this is, for example, like typical opening of a very expressionist, high modernist music, for example, Orchesterstücke by Schoenberg. If you look at this gesture that this is a gesture that is very much related to, however much mediated, a human utterance in some way. It is somewhat structured around the logics of an utterance, of the rhetorics of an utterance. Even in the Von William original also has very much it's almost like a sung melody. There's definitely like a reference to like the body or the voice or however much mediated, but there's still a reference to the body, to the voice present. Whereas the sampler then cuts this out and kind of erases this relationship to the body and moves the reference more to the surface of the sample itself.
sample embodies a rhetorical gesture, a horn melody in its phraseology not dissimilar to a sung vocal line, accompanied by the up and down movement of the strings themselves in two response-like figures, and so forth. But the way the score sample, in contrast, acts upon the Ray Vaughan Williams sample is in some way comparable to the Warhol's photo print operation. It cuts out a section of it without ever revealing the totality of the scene, which is the symphony that it refers to. The totality as a reference is not readable via the completion of a hermeneutic gesture, and that interpretation invites us as listeners and viewers to do. So the totality of the scene, which is the entirety of the score excerpt, is in some way eclipsed by the sampling operation. The resulting texture of the cut and pasted sample snippet is almost actively working against the perception of the score excerpt as a rhetorical unity embedded in a larger musical narrative, the symphonic context. This sampling operation is thus preventing us as listeners to reach through, so to speak, via the hermeneutic gesture of the totality, to the totality of the scene, out of which the texture is built. And so what we're left with is the ever-shifting, ever-changing surface, a constant reordering of similar but never exactly the same musical material. Instead of looking through the window of the source material to some musical truth, for which the rhetorics of musical gesture are merely the apparent formal expression, the window turns into a cracked surface, reflecting patterns of non-repeating and non-random cutouts from ever-shifting angles. Let me just jump to the end here. And this is what I want to bring up as the last consideration here, and that's the political implications of this aesthetic. Apart from the fact that Hiendl is quite obviously commenting on the appropriation, commodification, and disintegration of cultural artifacts by the logic of the market, as Ralph Vaughan Williams as a relaxing orchestra music, an evacuation and re-signification of cultural meanings, which the score sampler, by reducing its material content to a bare minimum, stretching the very little to a whole hour, pushes to a far extreme. I hope for this piece to also be seen as a proposed framework, an experimental environment in which we can rehearse how to inhabit a reality that is inherently and dominated by machines and the logic by which they interface physical reality with human culture. It may also be the end, finally, of historical master narratives, the broken promises of linear historical progress, and the attendant hopes for social justice and upward mobility that, as Laure has brilliantly shown us, delegates us into the condition of a continuous, stretched-out present that does not move anywhere anymore, where we are forced to improvise our way not forward, but laterally, maybe. A postmodernist condition for which the animated still life may be a better or more adequate aesthetic representation and expression than the narrativized linear and ultimately utopian forms of modernist art practices. Thank you.